Excuse me. That seat's taken. The voice came from a small woman in her 70s named Patricia Cowell, who was standing in the aisle of the Willard Intercontinental Ballroom holding a laminated badge on a lanyard that identified her as a guest of the Department of Defense. She had been saying this sentence to the man currently occupying the seat for approximately 30 seconds. And the man was not moving, and Patricia Cowell was running out of the particular variety of polite persistence she had brought to the situation. The seat was in the third row of the reserved section, left aisle. The placard on the armrest said, Beaumont. The man in the seat had looked at the placard and had not moved. The man's name was Garrett Ellison. He was 47 years old, worked for a defense consulting firm, and had arrived at the National Medal of Honor Society annual convention in Washington, D.C., with the particular assurance of someone who has attended enough events at this level to have developed strong opinions about the proximity of good seats to people worth speaking to. He wore a dark suit with a flag pin on the lapel that he had purchased specifically for events like this one. He was on his phone. There are open seats in the back, he said, without looking up from the phone. Sir, those seats are reserved. The placard. I'll move when the person gets here. Still without looking up, Patricia Cowell looked around the ballroom with the expression of someone who has done the moral calculus and found it insufficient for the task at hand. The room held 500 people, arranged in round tables in the back half and straight rows in the reserved front section closest to the dais. The Willard Intercontinental Ballroom was not a casual venue. It had hosted presidents and treaties and the particular variety of Washington occasion that requires high ceilings and good acoustics and carpeting that absorbs the sound of a great many important shoes. Tonight it held the annual convention of the National Medal of Honor Society, which meant that the 500 people present represented a specific cross-section of the American military universe. Recipients and their families, senior officers from all four branches, representatives from veterans organizations, and a stratum of civilian attendees whose presence reflected the event's position at the intersection of institutional memory and policy relevance. The days was set for 12, the surviving Medal of Honor recipients who would be honored at the evening's ceremony. Around the room, the ambient sound of 500 people engaged in the particular subdued version of cocktail party conversation that people produce when they are simultaneously at a networking event and at a solemn occasion, and have not entirely decided which one takes precedence. The old man whose seat it was had been standing in the aisle behind Ellison for 45 seconds. His name was Arthur James Beaumont. He was 91 years old. He had arrived at the Willard 20 minutes early. He had a practice of arriving early to events that required precision about seating. Because arriving early made everything simpler, and he was a man who had spent his life simplifying the things that could be simplified so that energy was available for the things that could not. He was wearing a suit that was 22 years old, charcoal gray, bought for his wife's funeral and worn on the most serious occasions since. It fit him the way things fit men of 91 who were built lean to begin with, precisely, without room to spare. He wore no medals. He wore no insignia of any kind. His hands, at his sides, were what his hands had always been, large for a man of his size, with the particular quality of stillness that comes not from rest but from systems trained to precision over many decades and that have retained that precision even now, even at rest, even at 91. He was carrying a paper program for the evening's ceremony, which he had folded in half along a precise crease, and a small American flag on a wooden dowel that he had picked up from the table at the entrance, and he was standing in the aisle behind Garrett Ellison's seat with the patience of someone who has learned that patience is not the absence of will, but its most controlled expression. He was not going to say anything. He had considered it and decided against it, because the calculus of the situation as he understood it was this: the man in his seat would eventually become aware that the seat was occupied by someone whose right to it was better than his own, and the situation would resolve itself, and making a scene would cost more than waiting. He had been in situations that cost more than waiting. He knew the difference. He waited. Patricia Cowell had taken a half step toward the security desk at the edge of the room when the sound came through the ballroom's PA system. Not the ceremony yet. The ceremony was still 11 minutes away. It was the opening bars of the national anthem, piped in from somewhere before the live performance began. The particular recorded version that sounds in the moments before major ceremonies, and the sound moved through the Willard Ballroom the way it moves through any room where it is played. By producing in the people present the particular internal shift of standing, of hands on hearts, of the conversation stopping as if a valve has been closed. Arthur did not hear the opening bars. He heard something else. The smell of the ballroom, carpet and floral arrangements, and the warm press of 500 people in a formally ventilated space dissolved. What came back was the smell of mud and cold air, and the specific mineral smell of Korean hillside in November of 1951, at an altitude where the air is thin enough that breathing takes more effort than you'd expect, and where the wind comes off the ridge. Without interruption, and the temperature at 0300 is not survivable by someone who is wet and still. He was 20 years old. He was on the northeast slope of Hill 438, which is not a landmark and not a name, and which appears on no map that has ever been made available to the public, and he was carrying a man. The man weighed 168 pounds in his boots. Arthur weighed 143 pounds in his. The man he was carrying had taken a round through the left shoulder and another through the upper thigh, and was conscious but not reliably so. Conscious enough to be aware of what was happening, not conscious enough to assist with it. The man's name was William Hargrove. He was 22 years old. He was the most junior lieutenant in the company, and had been in country for 3 weeks, and was going to die on this hill in the next 40 minutes if Arthur Beaumont did not make a decision that required him to leave the position he'd been holding and expose himself to the specific geometry of fire that had been making the northeast slope of Hill 438 a very particular kind of difficult for the last 4 hours. Arthur had made the decision. He made it the way he had been taught to make decisions in this context, not by weighing the personal cost, which was incalculable and therefore useless as a variable, but by asking what the mission required. The mission required that the man get off this hill. Arthur was the person available to move the man. The decision followed. He carried William Hargrove 900 meters down the northeast slope of Hill 438, through a darkness that was not quite total. The flares from the adjacent company were dropping intermittently, making the shadows move in ways that were worse than the darkness. With the round that had taken out his left arm's full range of motion 30 minutes earlier, making the left side of the carry into a problem he was solving in real time. With whatever the body does when it has exceeded its design specifications and is operating on something older and less articulable than training. He did not think about it. He did not think about very much. He put one foot down and then the next, and he held the weight with what he had, and he did not stop. He had never told this story to anyone who had not already known it. He did not tell it now. He carried it the way he carried it every day, the way you carry the things that became part of you before you understood what kind of weight they were going to be. Hargrove was carried off the hill. He did not die. He was 19 months in recovery. He went back. He served for 32 more years. He was awarded the Medal of Honor in 1969 for actions in Vietnam that Arthur read about in a newspaper clipping that he kept, for reasons he never examined closely, in the back of a desk drawer in his house in Columbus, Ohio, for 55 years. The opening bars of the national anthem came back. The Willard Ballroom, the carpet, the floral arrangements, the 500 people. Arthur straightened. His left hand, the one that had been at his side, was pressed flat against his thigh now, a gesture of steadying, of returning from somewhere that the body sometimes went without asking first. He looked at the seat. He looked at Garrett Ellison, still on his phone. He looked at the program in his hand, folded on its precise crease. He looked at the dais. On the dais, 12 chairs. 11 already occupied by men in various varieties of the dress that Medal of Honor recipients wear at official functions. Some in uniform, some in suits with the medal hung at the collar. The 12th chair was occupied by a man in army dress blues, 4 stars on each shoulder, white-haired and erect, who was doing what the man had always done in every situation Arthur had ever observed him in. Scanning the room with the specific efficiency of someone who has spent 60 years understanding what information a room contains and processing it quickly. General William Hargrove's eyes found Arthur Beaumont. They found him the way they had always found him, across whatever distance, across a dark Korean hillside in 1951, across a hospital ward in 1952, across a parking lot at a VFW reunion in 1987 when they had not seen each other in 11 years and Hargrove had known him at 50 meters by the way he stood. The distance in the Willard Ballroom was 32 meters. It did not matter. What happened next happened in the time that it takes a man who has made a decision to act on it. General William Hargrove rose from his chair on the dais. He did not speak to the people on either side of him. He did not consult anyone. He descended the 2 steps from the dais to the ballroom floor and walked, with the specific, measured pace of a 4-star general who is going somewhere that matters, across the full length of the Willard Ballroom, through the seated rows, through the gap between tables where a server was holding a tray of water glasses and stepped aside without being asked, to the aisle in the 3rd row of the reserved section where an old man in a 22-year-old suit was standing with a folded program in one hand and a small American flag on a wooden dowel in the other. 500 people were watching. They were watching because a 4-star general had stood up from the dais and walked across the room, and the room had understood, collectively and without discussion, that whatever was about to happen was not on the program. Hargrove stopped in front of Arthur. He looked at his old sergeant, at the charcoal suit, at the folded program, at the flag on the wooden dowel, at the face he had been looking at in his memory for 73 years. He looked at him the way you look at someone you owe everything to when you finally have the context to say so out loud. He turned to the room. His voice was the voice of a man who has spent 60 years being heard in large spaces, not raised, exactly, but carrying, in the way that authority carries when it does not need to announce itself. "This man's name is Arthur Beaumont," he said. He did not use rank. He did not use title. He said the name the way the name should be said, which was the way he had said it in his own mind for 73 years. He carried me off a hill in Korea in November of 1951. I weighed 168 pounds. He carried me 900 meters. With a compromised arm, in the dark, under fire. He was 20 years old. The ballroom was very quiet. Arthur Beaumont served in the United States Army from 1950 to 1974. His combat record includes actions in Korea and 2 advisory deployments that remain classified. He received the Silver Star, the Bronze Star with Valor device, and 2 Purple Hearts. The first Purple Heart for an arm wound sustained in the action for which I am standing in front of you right now. An action for which he was also recommended for the Medal of Honor. A recommendation that was downgraded through a bureaucratic process that I spent 30 years being unable to explain and another 30 years accepting as one of the permanent injustices that institutions produce without intending to. He paused. His voice did not change temperature. He was also, for the 14 years I served with him at various points in both our careers, the most reliable man I ever worked alongside. Which is not a decoration. It does not appear in any file. It is the only assessment that matters. He turned to Garrett Ellison. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "Sir," he said with a precision of address that was entirely different from the words usual social function, "I need you to stand up." Ellison stood up. He did it with the speed of a man whose body has responded before his mind has caught up, which was perhaps the most honest thing he had done in the last hour. Hargrove turned to Arthur. "Sergeant Beaumont," he said. "Your seat." Arthur looked at Hargrove for a moment. He looked at him with the particular quality of attention he brought to things that required him to be accurate, not sentimental, not overwhelmed, but present and clear. Something moved in his face that was not emotion exactly, but the outward sign of an internal recognition. The recognition of being seen, fully, by someone who has always known what they were looking at. He walked to his seat and sat down. And then General William Hargrove, 4 stars on his shoulders, Medal of Honor at his collar, did not return to the dais. He took the empty seat beside Arthur. The ceremony began 6 minutes later. During those 6 minutes, neither man spoke. Hargrove's aide appeared at the edge of the row, whispered something, gestured toward the dais where Hargrove's chair remained empty. Hargrove shook his head once, with the quality of finality that a man of his rank projects when he has made a decision and the decision is not available for review. The aide withdrew. Someone on the dais leaned over and spoke to someone else, and the something that passed between them produced, in the second person, a small, contained nod that said, "Understood." The orchestra tuned. The lights adjusted. Programs rustled across the room with the collective, papery sound of 500 people consulting the order of events. Arthur looked at the program he was holding, folded on its precise crease. He looked at the names on the cover, the names of the recipients being honored. The 12th name was William Hargrove, listed last, which meant he would speak last, which meant he would be here beside Arthur until the very end of the ceremony. He had not planned for this. He had not planned for any of what had happened in the last 14 minutes. He was 91 years old, and he did not, at this stage of his life, plan for much beyond the next reasonable thing, and the next reasonable thing now was to sit here and watch the ceremony that he had come to watch. He unfolded the program along its crease and refolded it the other direction and set it in his lap. Beside him, Hargrove said nothing. He sat with the same quality of presence that Arthur had known in him for 73 years, quiet, aware, oriented toward whatever needed his attention next. In this case, nothing needed his attention. He was simply here. He had spent 20 years sitting at the front of rooms like this one, and what he had understood only recently. Understood in the way that things become clear at a certain age, not suddenly but steadily, the way a fog lifts when the wind changes, was that the sitting at the front had always been the wrong seat. The right seat was wherever the person who put you there was sitting. He had looked for that person in 100 rooms. Tonight, he had found him. Arthur looked at the dais, at the 11 remaining chairs, the people moving toward them, the lights beginning their adjustment toward ceremony. He thought about Hill 438. He thought about the wait and the dark and the cold and the 900 meters. He thought about Hargrove in the hospital in Busan, 3 weeks after the Hill. When Arthur had appeared in the doorway of the ward and Hargrove had looked up from the bed, and the first thing Hargrove had said was, "You're not supposed to be alive." And Arthur had said, "Neither are you." And that had been the whole of the conversation, because it had contained everything that needed to be said, and neither of them had found it necessary to add anything to it in the 73 years since. He thought about the 11 names he carried: Graves, Thibodeau, Park, Okonkwo, Ramrez, Lindfist, Al-Rashidi. Beaumont, not him. A cousin, different war. Chen, Delgado, Morrison. He said their names to himself in the order he always said them, which was the order of their deaths, which was the order in which the weight had been added, which was the only order that made sense. He had been saying them in this order for 60 years. He would say them until he could not. The lights dimmed. The orchestra played. The first name was called. Arthur Beaumont sat in his seat in the third row of the reserved section of the Willard Intercontinental Ballroom on an October evening in Washington, D.C., with a 4-star general sitting to his left and a small American flag on a wooden dowel in his right hand. And he watched the ceremony the way he had always intended to watch it, from close enough to see the faces clearly. When the 12th name was called and Hargrove rose and walked to the podium, Arthur watched him go with the specific attention of someone who has carried a person and who retains, somewhere in the body's memory, the particular weight and shape of them. Hargrove spoke from the podium for 7 minutes. He spoke about the men who did not come home. He did not speak about Hill 438, and he did not speak about Arthur Beaumont by name, and he did not look at the third row of the reserved section in a way that could be photographed and turned into a story for the next day's news. He simply spoke about the ones who carried others. He had been told, over 20 years of speaking at events like this one, that his remarks were always the most memorable of the evening. He had never understood why, until tonight, when he understood that the reason was this. He was not speaking from memory or from duty or from the accumulated rhetoric of a long career. He was speaking from debt. The debt was sitting in the third row. The debt was 91 years old, with a small American flag in its right hand, and it was watching him with the patient, accurate eyes of someone who knows exactly what was carried and what it cost, and who does not require anyone else to understand in order for it to be true. That was all he had wanted. That was what he had come for. And now he had it. There are debts that cannot be repaid in the currency that exists, that exceed by such a magnitude. Anything that can be offered in return, that the only honest response to them is presence. Hargrove had understood this for 73 years. He had not found the moment, until tonight, to make the presence literal. The moment, when it came, required no planning and no speech and no ceremony beyond the walking across a room in front of 500 people and saying the name out loud and taking the seat. Some debts are paid not by giving something, but by simply not pretending they don't exist. General Hargrove stopped pretending. That was enough. That was everything. If this story moved you, if you believe that the ones who carried others deserve to be seen, and that the seat at the front of the room is the right seat for the right person, hit that like button, share this video with someone who knows what that hill costs, and subscribe to Veterans Valor, where every story begins with someone who gave more than they were asked and never stopped showing up.